I'm Chris Lawrenson, and this is Slurp, Gulp, and Start on Sounds. In 2011, I finished writing and designing my poetry anthology. Excited to publish, I ordered a hard copy to finally proofread. That copy arrived, but then my hard drive died, taking all the files with it. The book was never published, and this singular copy has been on my shelf ever since. But now I'm sharing it with you. In this podcast, I'm reading poems from the book and diving more deeply into some of them. Follow along in the show notes on to the episode. Let me see, of, God and pain, relationships, how we deceive ourselves, how we can sometimes become our own worst enemies. And if you listen to my introduction episode, the first episode on this podcast, where I read the introduction that I wrote to this book, 10 or 11 years ago now, is about how to read this book. And I felt like this was, I think for my poetry, I've always felt like this has been an important aspect of my poetry, that there's a real auditory element here. I've always felt like I don't like the idea of somebody just reading my poetry with no auditory reference, if that makes sense. I wonder how many poets feel that way. I think I say that because so much of the cadence and tone, I feel like, is just as important as the words of the poem itself. I know that that's probably not super sustainable. You can't sell a bunch of books without and just be there to read it to every single person. But I've always really enjoyed reading poetry, and I think it's because of the lyricism, the musicality of it, and I think how words and even the sounds that words make can dig way deeper than just their meaning in a dictionary. And I think all of us in the literary world, or who have enjoyed poetry before, can appreciate that, the poetry is a classic example of something where the art form is more than the sum of its parts. And I think this poem is probably one of mine where I think that it's a good example of that. When I read this poem, I think of so many memories that I felt like the feelings of those memories and sometimes bad experiences have been poured into this poem. In the poem, I talk about this Japanese village and the color of the tile that's on the roofs of their houses. And then I also talk about a blue Japanese bridge. And those, for me, are not, they're not sort of concrete metaphorical representations of anything, but in the poem, it felt really important to paint a picture of something that was unrealistic. When I read this poem so many years later, I'm looking at some of my notes here in the book, and I've got the last two stanzas were added in September and October of 2005. So this was, many years ago. When I read this now, it makes me almost feel sad, at at seeing the pain that I was able to pour into this poem. And there are some lines in here that I feel like really hammer home some of the ideas that I was thinking of. This fourth line here, it says, "I recognize that love is not subjective, it's offensive enough." And I think for me at the time, I wonder if that was maybe somewhere coming out of my family experience where just some rough patches with my family. And then I think there's this visual of these villagers painting their blue tiles red, and they're doing it overnight in secret. And we don't know why, but they're hiding something and pretending that something is true when it isn't. And I think that I was using that as some kind of visual metaphor to I think express a way that I had felt probably mistreated at some point. I know that most of you listening can relate to this in some degree, just being in touch with the pain of being lied to or being misled, the disappointment that it can bring with it. I know for myself, I have a deep, deep desire for connection with my friends, my family, both immediate family and wider family. I think we're born with this sense, this need, sort of a desperation for deep connection with others. I think this poem is about when that breaks down. It's when that connection doesn't just fail to happen, but is actually severed. Thanks for listening. To support and influence this work, head over to patreon.com/chrispoetry, where there's lots of free bonus content and more opportunities to support and influence this work. To help the show, leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. See you next Wednesday.